The tremor was subtle at first, more a whisper through the soles of Jacob's shoes than anything audible. He thought it was the HVAC kicking in again, the old ductwork rattling above his office ceiling. But the whisper became a vibration, then a groan, and soon the glass panes lining the far wall began to shiver in their frames. Papers fluttered from desks. Someone laughed nervously and asked if that was an earthquake. Someone else called out that maybe construction was happening nearby. Jacob's chair scraped back across the carpet as he stood, his stomach already tightening in ways that had nothing to do with logic. He looked toward the long windows 39 stories up, where sunlight cut across a skyline of towers. Everything outside was calm. Everything inside felt wrong. The first scream came when the overhead lights flickered, a sharp electric stutter followed by a loud metallic pop from somewhere above the ceiling tiles. A steel beam far overhead groaned like a giant grinding its teeth. And then it started, an uneven lurch, a tilt in the floor that sent pens rolling, coffee mugs spilling, bodies grabbing the edges of desks. The building was moving. Alarms followed seconds later, their shrill howls slicing the air. The fire sprinklers didn't trigger, but red strobes began to pulse along the hallways. The office was instantly chaos. Chairs toppled out, a man shouted for everyone to get to the stairwell. A woman tripped and went down hard on the carpet. People hesitated, unsure if this was real, if they should grab their phones, their bags, their coats. Jacob didn't remember deciding to move, only that his legs carried him into the hallway as plaster dust shook loose from the ceiling. He grabbed Marissa by the arm when she stumbled, pulled her upright. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her hand shaking in his. They joined the tide pressing toward the emergency exit, but before they reached it another shudder rolled through the tower. This one was worse, that a sound like snapping bones filled the air as something gave way deep in the structure. The stairwell door was already jammed with bodies when Jacob reached it. People pushed and shoved, panic thick in the air. He held Marissa close, shielding her from elbows, from the crush of people desperate to get through. For a few seconds the flow stopped entirely and all he could hear were ragged breaths and the groan of metal under strain. Then the door swung open wider and they spilled onto the concrete stairwell, the crowd surging downward in frantic waves. The stairwell smelled of dust and paint, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Jacob gripped the railing as the floor shook again, this time harder, the kind of motion that made your stomach lurch and your ears pop. Someone ahead fell, and the chain of bodies behind nearly trampled him before strangers yanked him upright again. The panic was alive, a beast with claws tearing at the crowd. By the 12th step Jacob heard something behind them, a crack, a scream, and turned in time to see the upper landing split. A section of concrete crumbled and two people dropped with it, their screams vanishing in the roar below. Marissa shrieked, clutched Jacob's arm. He dragged her down, forcing his feet to keep moving even as his knees trembled. They descended floor by floor, the press of bodies tightening around them. Someone was sobbing uncontrollably. Someone else was shouting prayers. At one landing the crowd hesitated again. The way forward was blocked by fallen debris, a tangle of rebar and plaster dust. The mob threatened to turn back, a tide reversing, but Jacob spotted a narrow gap along the side where part of the railing had torn loose. He shoved Marissa toward it, forced his own shoulders through, the jagged metal cutting into his shirt. Others followed, screaming, pushing, desperate not to be trapped. On the next floor they spilled into a hallway thick with smoke. Sprinklers here had triggered, but the water sprayed uselessly against broken tiles, raining down in erratic bursts. The acrid smell of fire stung Jacob's throat. Somewhere nearby something was burning fast. "Keep moving," he shouted, though his voice felt swallowed by the noise. A man clutched at him suddenly, blood streaking his forehead. "My wife's in there," he gasped, pointing toward an office door half collapsed with debris. The others kept pushing past, uncaring, blind to his desperation. Jacob hesitated, felt Marissa tugging his sleeve. The building shuddered again, ceiling tiles crashing down. For one split second, Jacob's mind fractured between two roads. Drag Marissa forward and leave the man, or stop and risk everything. He swore and shoved Marissa toward the crowd. "Go. Keep going, don't stop," he yelled at her, his chest clenching when she screamed his name but obeyed. Then he turned back. The office door was wedged shut under broken plasterboard. Jacob threw his shoulder into it once, twice, until the frame splintered and gave way. Inside, choking black smoke swirled from a burning desk. A woman was pinned beneath a fallen beam, her face gray with dust, her hands weakly clawing at the rubble. Jacob dropped to his knees, his muscles burning as he strained to lift the beam. It shifted inches, but the fire was spreading, licking closer. "I can't," the husband coughed, eyes streaming, but he joined Jacob, heaving with all his strength. Together they moved it enough to drag her free. She screamed when her crushed leg shifted, then went limp. They pulled her out into the hallway where smoke and panic reigned. Jacob's lungs burned as he shoved the woman into her husband's arms. "Get her down," he rasped, but when he turned to find Marissa, she was gone, swept into the tide. The realization hit harder than the smoke in his chest. The crowd had carried her away, maybe downward, maybe elsewhere. He lurched after them, coughing, vision swimming. Every step down the stairwell was a fight now, the floor trembling, dust raining, screams echoing. Somewhere below, a massive crash reverberated, followed by silence that felt worse than any noise. Jacob descended into that silence, his heart hammering, each landing a battlefield of collapsed concrete and terrified faces. The silence didn't hold. It couldn't. It cracked open under the pressure of the building's own voice, metal grinding against metal, a bass tremor moving through concrete like a living thing. It rose from below, a distant avalanche of something massive collapsing, then faded to a muffled hum. Jacob kept going because there was nothing else to do. People bled through his periphery, faces gray with dust, mouths open in ugly ovals, eyes streaming. Someone handed him a half-crushed bottle of water without a word. He rinsed his mouth and spit black, wiped his lips with the back of his hand, passed the rest to the next person without looking at them. It didn't matter whose hand took it. It mattered that someone did. On a landing somewhere in the early 30s, a child's voice cut through the din. Jacob turned his head and found a girl no older than 8 clinging to the balustrade, fingers bloodless, cheeks striped with tears. The man behind her was pushing too hard, didn't see her. Jacob wedged himself into the flow, forced a gap with his shoulders and crouched. The girl wouldn't let go. He put his hand over hers. "You're okay. We're moving okay? What's your name?" "Lily," she whispered, lips trembling. The stairwell shook and she flinched, a tiny recoil. A woman came down behind her, coughing, smearing her mouth with the back of her wrist. "She's mine." "I, please?" She looked at Jacob as if asking permission to claim her own child. "Hold her hand," he said, steady voice that wasn't at all how his lungs felt. He stood and used his body to cut a path, taking a heel to the shin and a shoulder to the ribs and not caring. He took Lily's free hand and kept it until they reached the next landing, then passed it back to her mother, made eye contact, nodded, moved on. The descending flock splintered without warning. On the low 30s, the stairwell ahead ended in a wall of buckled concrete. The steps vanished into a slanted heap as if the building had swallowed its own throat. A wave of bodies turned, surging back, panic compressing human flesh into something less human. People shouted that they were trapped. More voices rose, the air tightened. Jacob pressed himself to the inner curve of the stairwell, held himself there with the railing and looked to his left. There was a door to the 32nd floor, the push bar clogged with dust. A sign said, "No access." It didn't matter what the sign said. He shoved it open and was hit by heat. The hallway beyond glowed amber, lit by emergency strips along the floor and a few surviving ceiling fixtures that threw oscillating shadows because everything was swaying. Smoke hugged the ceiling like a low cloud. The drops from a broken pipe spattered onto a carpet dark with water. A printer lay on its side, wheels still spinning weakly as if the fall had confused it. Somewhere down the hall, something popped with a flat, angry sound. "This way," Jacob shouted, waving people through. He grabbed the nearest person's sleeve and yanked them into motion. The crowd hesitated, then flowed. It took only 1 or 2 bodies to make a decision for the whole. He kept to the side, steadying those who stumbled, pulling against the outward tug of panic. On the 32nd floor, the offices were emptied of purpose, their glass walls spidered with cracks. A conference room table had slid 2 feet from its usual position and now sat crooked like a tongue. He took them past it, to a corner where the emergency plan in his head remembered that 2 stairwells served this side of the tower. He pushed through another door and found himself back in concrete. This stairwell was clear. The sight of those descending steps hit him like a drug. They funneled into it, a river trying to find the sea. Jacob took the second to last place and let himself become a backstop. He counted breaths without meaning to. 30, 31, 32. He had no idea what he was counting toward. His pocket buzzed against his thigh, his phone, phantom battery. He pulled it out of reflex and saw nothing but a cracked black screen throwing back his own dirt-smudged face. He stuffed it away. He looked for Marissa in every face that turned up to him. He didn't see her. He saw a teenage boy with a split lip and fury in his eyes, a woman in a suit who had stopped wearing shoes, a janitor with a bandana tied across his nose. He saw a man with ash-gray hair and a blood-soaked tie who kept whispering "I'm sorry" into no one's ear. The stairwell turned and turned. Somewhere around the 28th floor, the smell shifted from burning plastic to something far more industrial. The breath of the building's innards brushed his face, hot steel and electric ozone. The lights flickered, the hand on his back changed. Someone fell near his knee. He reached down and pulled them up by instinct. A tremor hit hard, the steps lurched underfoot and a shower of concrete grit rained from above. The handrail juddered in his palm. There was a screech like a metal animal being flayed. Jacob grabbed the rail with both hands, saw the world tilt, and watched in slow motion as a man 3 steps below him missed his footing and pitched forward. 2 people reached for him and missed. He hit the landing with his shoulder and slid into the wall. The sound that came out of him wasn't human. "Hold," Someone screamed from somewhere above, and it was both a command and a plea. People obeyed because fear and gravity demanded it. The stairwell held, momentary stillness settling like shaky breath finally caught. When the movement began again, it did so in gasps. It was no longer a rushing stream but a staggered procession. Jacob took stock of those closest. A woman with thick glasses had a gash across her temple that was barely bleeding because the dust was caking it closed. An older man gripped the rail so hard his knuckles looked like porcelain. A young guy in a hoodie kept muttering that they had to jump floors fast because the building was going to pancake. Jacob didn't tell him not to say that because it was probably true, and the word had already escaped into the air. At the 25th, they hit another blockade. This time it wasn't a collapse but a fire, hot and clean, sweeping up the shaft of the stairwell from a lower floor. Heat pulsed against their faces, the air sucking inward as if the flames inhaled. The emergency door to the floor was closed and probably hot to the touch. Jacob reached out anyway, brushed the metal, felt the bite. He jerked his hand back, skin singing. He pivoted, looked into the faces around him, saw hopes loose their moorings. He didn't have a plan, he had motion. He shoved through the nearest floor door, felt it give, and led them into another corridor, this one cluttered with boxes of printed promotional materials, the scattered guts of a marketing department. He coughed hard enough that his vision freckled. He grabbed a rag from a toppled cleaning cart and pressed it to his mouth, then ripped off strips with shaking fingers to hand to those closest. "Wet it if you can," he said, like a memory from a fire safety talk had crept back from a dead life. Someone passed a half-full water bottle forward. They drank and spat and pressed the cloths to their faces like relics. A security officer's station appeared like an island in the hallway, thick desk bolted to the floor, monitors dark, radio half buried in dust. Jacob stopped, grabbed the radio, thumbed the button. It crackled, then erupted in a chaos of voices, none of which resolved into sense beyond the scream of sirens and overlapping codes that meant nothing to him. "Hello?" Jacob shouted, voice raw. "This is the 25th floor, second stairwell blocked by fire, we're moving laterally." He didn't know if that was even the right language. Static swallowed him. A male voice broke through, clipped and professional. "Copy 25th, conditions? Fire in the main stairwell. We're trying to find an alternate down. Smoke heavy. Proceed to core if possible," the voice said, and then there was another burst of static and then, "Avoid elevator shafts. Repeat, avoid shafts. Chimney effect." "Copy," Jacob said, not sure if he was heard, then dropped the radio into the pocket of his jacket like it might store some of the voice's authority. The core meant mechanical rooms, electrical, the belly of the tower where pipes and cables ran like veins. He remembered seeing it once during a fire drill that had doubled as a tour. He led them in that direction, the group behind him thinner now because people had peeled off at other doors, unable to keep trusting the stranger with blood on his knuckles. He couldn't blame them that he wasn't sure he would have trusted himself. The core corridor had reinforced doors and no windows. It felt like a bunker. "We don't belong here," Jacob thought. "This is the building's private body." He pushed a door and felt a draft of air hit his face. The room beyond was huge, a cathedral of steel and ductwork, with catwalks running like narrow bridges in the half-light. The floor trembled underfoot in an irregular pulse. "Careful," he said automatically, unnecessary because there was no alternative to care. The path itself insisted on it. They picked their way along a catwalk single file. Below, through gaps, he saw a dark mass that might have been a backup generator and, beyond it, a flicker of something bright. He couldn't tell if it was fire or the kind of light that happens when thick dust catches a beam. The air was hotter here but cleaner. The smoke had not found a way to rest, kept moving as if it too wanted out. A man behind him, mid-40s, steel-toe boots, maybe maintenance, spoke up. "There's a service stair on the other side. Used it last month for a lockout." His certainty felt like a hand on Jacob's spine pushing him forward. They crossed the catwalk slowly, step by shaky step. The building groaned again, a long, low moan that felt intimate after so much noise. Jacob paused, hand white around the rail, waited out the sound, then moved. They reached the service stair. The door was bent on its hinges but not enough to deny them. The stairwell inside was narrow, concrete, rough and close. It didn't look like anything that would save a life. It looked like a throat that could close at any moment. The maintenance man squeezed by Jacob with a nod and took point, moving faster than anyone else seemed able to. Jacob followed, then the line of those he had gathered. He kept counting breaths. They made it down 2 flights before the light shifted. It brightened not because the building had given them mercy but because a slab of wall on the floor below had fallen away, creating a ragged hole like a tooth knocked from a jaw. The gash opened them to an office space where dust drifted in thick sheets. The maintenance man crouched at the edge, judged distances with his eyes. "We can cross," he said, pointing to a desk that jutted at an angle over the collapse. "One at a time, no bounce." He was already moving before he finished speaking, setting his weight, testing, stepping light across the desk surface like it was a frozen pond. He made it to the other side and turned, his face ghosted with dust but eyes sharp. He held out his hand. Jacob gestured to the next person, a woman with a limp who looked like she hadn't spoken since the tremors began. She locked eyes with him, then with the maintenance man, and stepped. The desk creaked but held. She made it. A boy followed, too fast. He stumbled. The desk shifted. The maintenance man grabbed his wrist. Jacob grabbed his belt. For a few seconds, the boy hung between them over a mouth of darkness that seemed to sigh in anticipation. They dragged him back upright. He sobbed without sound, shoulders shaking. "Slow," Jacob said, voice flat because his nerves were threadbare. "One at a time." He gestured to the next and the next until it was his turn. The desk depressed under his foot with a groan that vibrated up his bones. He kept his weight forward, eyes on the maintenance man's hand, and made the reach in one motion that felt like a leap. The maintenance man's palm was dry and warm and solid. Jacob took it and then let go because there was no time to savor solidity. They were becoming a unit without knowing each other's names. That was the trick of such days, Jacob thought in some detached pocket of his mind. It flattened time. There was before, there was this, there would be after for some. He couldn't imagine after. They continued down through the service stair. It was cooler there. The sound changed again, less fire, more water. A pipe had burst somewhere nearby, and he could hear it pouring, slapping, the fast laughter of broken hydraulics. They came out near the 20th floor into a hallway that had become a river. Water sluiced ankle-deep across the tile, pushing paper and broken glass and someone's framed photograph of a dog along at a gentle speed that felt obscene. Jacob put his hands to the wall to steady himself and moved sideways, a crab walk that kept him from going down. The first body here was face down in the current. He stopped because he had to. He turned the person gently, hands under shoulders, and found a young man with a head wound, eyes half-lidded and unfocused. Still breathing. Jacob slid his hand under the man's neck and felt warmth that was not water. He looked up for help and it was already there. The maintenance man, the woman with the limp, the boy who had almost fallen. They hoisted the young man onto a dry spot, propped him with someone's rolling chair. Jacob tore his shirt and wadded it, pressed it to the head wound, held it there. The young man's breath blew damp against his wrist. I can stay, I can," the boy said, voice pitching up. "No," Jacob said, not unkindly. "We keep moving. If you stay you'll get trapped. We'll tell them where he is if we find them." He didn't define them. He didn't know if them existed. They left the young man propped and breathing. Jacob took a second right there and put his hand on the man's shoulder. It was a pointless gesture, but he couldn't stop himself. When he stood, he looked back once and then forced himself not to again. The hallways changed character around the 18th floor. The carpeting gave way to polished concrete. The walls were rawer, more industrial. They were near storage now, and the building's voice, through ductwork, through vibrations, was clearer. He heard yelling somewhere ahead. He moved toward it. A group of people had piled into an alcove because the door they needed to go through had wedged under a fallen beam. 3 of them were working at it with their hands, fingers bloodied. The others hovered uselessly, the way people hover while waiting for the thing that looks like salvation to do its work. The beam wasn't huge, but it was heavy enough to have its own gravity. "Leverage," Jacob said, and it was just a word until he made it action. He scanned and found a broken length of metal shelf. He wedged it under the beam as far as it would go. The maintenance man added his shoulder. They heaved. The beam lifted an inch, then 2. It felt like pushing a car through molasses. "Go," Jacob grunted, and the people filed through, squeezing sideways like it was a berth. He thought of nothing except the weight in his arms and the scream of his muscles. The last person through was a middle-aged woman with a soft face and the kind of purse that made no sense in a disaster. She hesitated, hand fluttering as if about to pat his arm, then ducked through. When she was clear, the building shuddered again with such violence that the shelf bar jumped in his hands. The beam slammed back down. Jacob rolled his shoulder away just in time to avoid it kissing bone. "We're good," the maintenance man said, eyes meeting his. "We keep going." They moved, not fast, not slow. The building decided their speed. The group changed constantly, shedding people at side doors now that paths seemed possible, swallowing new ones the way a river swallows tributaries. Jacob realized his mouth tasted of battery acid and copper and the sour of fear. He swallowed and found nothing to swallow. On the 15th they reached a real fork. 2 stairwells side by side, one marked east, the other west. The east door hung crooked, its inner side scorched black but passable. The west door looked cleaner, but the floor in front of it had sloped down and cracked. A fissure ran under the threshold like a warning. People elected for the clean one out of instinct. Jacob didn't. He put his hand to the east door, felt heat but not flame. He peered into the little window and saw a stairwell smoky but intact. The west door's window was clean, but beyond it the steps seemed to twist subtly as if seen through water. "This way," he called, pointing to the east. A few peeled toward him. Most didn't. They passed into the west like water seeking the path of least resistance. He reached out and caught the arm of one, a thin man with a backpack and terror in his mouth. "This one," Jacob said, nodding at the east. The man looked at him, at the door, at the stairs that looked wrong, and then he listened. He changed directions. The maintenance man watched, then shrugged, then gently urged 2 more to the east. But most went west. Jacob watched them go and felt something inside him crack in a way unrelated to the building's damage. He let go because he had no badge of authority, no reason to be believed. He took his little group into the east. The air inside tasted like old ductwork and smoke. They descended 3 flights. The noise hit them like a physical slap. A crash thundered down the shaft of the west stairwell, followed by a grinding shriek, and then what sounded like a sack of rocks poured into itself. The maintenance man made a sound, just a syllable with no consonant, pressed his back to the wall, eyes wide. Dust billowed from under the west door and turned the hallway into daylight fog. Someone screamed from far below, a sound with a blade in it. And then silence. Jacob didn't say anything, there was nothing to say. He looked at the door and put his palm to it because he had to. The metal throbbed faintly under his skin with old heat. He pulled his hand back, wiped it on his jeans without thinking. He realized his hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists until the tremor passed, then released them. "Keep moving," he said, and did. On the 12th they met firefighters. Not many, 2, maybe 3, it was hard to tell because they were shapes first, silhouettes swallowing smoke in husky breaths, helmets like dark moons. One of them had a hand on the wall, the other carried a hose that snaked up the steps and out of sight. Their coats glinted in the emergency lights. They looked like myths. The front one lifted a gloved hand, palm out. "Stop," he said through his mask, voice distorted. "Where from?" 25 down, Jacob said, and only then realized how absurd it was to say it like a provenance. East stairwell blocked by fire above 25, west compromised around 15, at least part collapse. It came out more coherent than he felt. It came out like he belonged to their language. The firefighter nodded as if that made anything better. His eyes, visible through the face shield, were bloodshot crescents. "Keep to east. Lobby compromised. Use north exit if you can reach 10. We've got a crew trying to clear." "How bad?" Jacob asked, enough of a relic of normal conversation left in him to think asking would change what was true. The firefighter didn't answer that. He handed Jacob a small cylinder. "Water. Keep people moving. If you see anyone unresponsive, don't stop unless it's safe. We'll sweep later." "Later?" Jacob pocketed the word. He nodded, and the firefighters squeezed past like urgent ghosts, going up into a world he had just fought to get out of. He wanted to grab one and ask if they had seen a woman named Marissa. He didn't. The thought of tethering them to his worry seemed like theft. They made the 10th. The air was less deadly here, but it was no cleaner. It held the sense of the lobby's guts, polish and spilled coffee, and the hot smell of many bodies forced into small spaces. The hallway spat them into a broad mezzanine that used to look elegant and now looked like an anatomy lesson of a building. Light slashed in from high windows where glass had once been. Debris lay like broken ribs. The north exit was a gash where a door used to swing, the frame twisted. People were clustered there trying to clear a path, a pile of them like a human dam. Jacob moved forward and saw why they were failing. The exit led not to outside but to a concrete vestibule whose far wall had caved in. Beyond it, open air, the smell of rain even though it wasn't raining. A man in a ragged suit stood with both hands on the edge, peering down. "Too far," he said to no one. Others picked at the debris like birds. Jacob stepped in, ignored the pain in his shoulders, and grabbed a fallen metal beam that had pinned the remains of a revolving door. 2 people he didn't know joined him without speaking. They lifted that it moved a little, then set with a sound that suggested it had found its only true resting place. He let go, breathing hard, wiped sweat from his eyes and only smeared more grit across his skin. "Back," someone shouted from behind. He turned. 2 firefighters were making a corridor through the crowd with brute force and presence, dragging a wheeled stretcher. They were heading not in but out toward the gash. One pointed at Jacob without seeming to intend to. "You," he said. "Help us make space." Jacob did, not because of the finger but because he wanted to be told what to do by someone who sounded like a world he recognized. They moved bodies aside, some resisting, some limp. The stretcher went to the edge. Jacob saw a set of temporary stairs, a rescue ladder structure, bolted and braced against the ravaged wall, leading downward into alley grit. Repurposed scaffolding. Fast. Dangerous. It held enough because no one had the bandwidth to imagine it not holding. "We need people who can move on their own down that," the firefighter said, lifting his mask just enough to be heard. His face was streaked with salt lines where sweat had carved clean paths and soot. He looked 10 years older than his eyes. "If you've got someone who needs carrying weight, we have more teams coming up. If you can walk, you go. This thing isn't going to be here forever." Jacob didn't ask what he meant by that. He saw it in the way the frame trembled, the way it complained at every footfall. He turned and became a mouthpiece, a funnel. He put his hands on shoulders and waistlines and guided. He counted bodies as they disappeared down the temporary stairs. 1, 2, 3. He felt each one leave the building like a small subtraction from a debt that would not be cleared. A woman with a fractured arm clutched her elbow to her ribs and shook her head at the ladder. "I can't," she said stubbornly, as if the choice had a moral dimension. "I can't." Jacob crouched. "Do you want me to go with you?" he asked, and he meant the question as plain. He would go. He would help. He watched her weigh everything. She nodded, eyes big as coins. He took her uninjured hand and guided her to the top, put her foot on the first rung. The ladder swayed and moaned as he stepped on behind her, one hand on the rail, one close enough to latch onto her if she slipped. They moved in little increments. His whole world became her heel and the rung below it. He could feel wind, the outside air was strange, feral. He could hear sirens, see the flash of red and blue reflected off broken glass like checks of color. He tried not to look down, not because he feared it but because he knew depth would split open something in his head that he had kept clamped shut. They reached the bottom. He passed her to a paramedic, eyes red-rimmed, who nodded thanks that felt like a benediction. Jacob met the medic's eyes. "There's a man on 20 with a head injury breathing," he said because he had stored that. The medic yelled to someone that information. It became part of a larger logistics that might or might not take human form. Jacob turned back to the ladder, put his hand on the rail to climb again, and froze because there was a sound smithing the air. The building above groaned and bucked like an animal throwing a certain kind of fit. A chunk of facade gave way 2 floors to the right, dragged other pieces with it, smashed into the bracing of the temporary stairs. The ladder shuddered. People screamed both above and below. The paramedic grabbed Jacob's forearm reflexively. "Stay," he said, as if that could keep a tower from claiming him. The ladder held, the groan passed, the noise resettled into the baseline roar of an emergency. Jacob let his breath come back. He made himself move. He went up again because he had decided, without ceremony, without a speech to himself between floors, that was what he was going to be. Someone who went back until there was nowhere left to go. At the top, the mezzanine was different because time had passed and time was everything. The crowd was thinner. The stretcher and crew had gone. New faces had replaced old. He saw the girl Lily again, her mother's hand white on her wrist. He caught Lily's eye and saw recognition, a fierce, small light in all that gray. He lifted a hand, a 2-fingered little wave, and she half smiled, then was gone into the flow toward the ladder. He wanted to follow, wanted to escort them down, but another sound cut that away. It was a scream shaped like a name. "Jacob." He whipped his head, heart tripping, stupid hope rising like a bubble. The woman who had shouted wasn't Marissa. She was older, hair a frizzed halo of white plaster. You're Jacob?" she asked, surprised by his response. "There's a man he's pinned," his hope drained without ceremony. He didn't let it show on his face. "Where?" he asked, and she pulled at his sleeve, led him along a corridor half collapsed, through a door of frosted glass crazed into 100 cat's cradle lines. The office beyond had been an insurance firm or a law practice, the kind of place people arranged other lives. The ceiling had come down onto a reception area, pinning a man under the island where they used to sign clipboards. He was awake, jaw set so hard the muscles stood out like cording. His legs were buried from the thigh down. Blood had soaked into the carpet, a stain whose edges were no longer clear. "Help," the woman breathed. The word was small, the room felt too big to hold it. Jacob crouched. "Hey," he said to the man. "I'm Jacob." He didn't know why he offered his name except that it felt like a bridge. "We're going to try to get you out." "Don't," the man hissed through his teeth. "If you can't, don't spend it on me." He was sweating, the kind that chills. He looked at Jacob with a clarity that was terrible. "Shut up," Jacob said softly. It was not unkind. He looked at the structure, the desk, the debris, the way slabs had slotted together like malicious Tetris. He looked for a lever, saw none that would do what he needed. He tried to slide his hands under the man's thigh and found that he could, but when he lifted, nothing changed. The man's leg was a stake in the ground. "Please," the woman said, her voice broke. "He's my..." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The building chose then to lurch again. Plaster dust dropped in a soft flurry that felt almost gentle. The eastern wall cracked with an almost delicate sound. Jacob leaned in, braced his shoulder against the side of the reception island, shoved with everything he had. The island shifted a millimeter, then thumped back. The man groaned in a way that made Jacob's stomach fold in on itself. He tried again. The island didn't care about human will. The structure held because buildings were meant to hold until they weren't. He pivoted, grabbed the man by the hand. "Listen," he said, hauling his gaze up until their eyes were locked. "What's your name?" "Ken," the man said. "Kenneth." That felt like a kind of defiance. "Okay, Ken." Jacob swallowed, his mouth was dry again. He glanced at the woman. Her eyes were pleading and furious, two currents that didn't cancel each other. His face didn't change. He kept his voice level. I'm going to try once more and then we have to go. I'm not going to lie to you. If we stay we die here. He let the words exist because not saying them wouldn't make them untrue. Ken blinked slowly then nodded once. Jacob and the maintenance man who had appeared at his shoulder like an answer to an unspoken request, positioned themselves, set their backs, and heaved. For a second the universe shrank to muscles and grit. Something gave inside the desk, the moan of screws pulling from wood. They moved it enough to make hope possible and not enough to matter. The debris that held Ken's legs didn't shift. Again, the maintenance man said, voice raw. One more, Jacob said. They tried, they failed. It wasn't a spectacular failure. It was the kind that was almost graceful. The desk settled. The room went silent but for Ken's breath whistling through clenched teeth. Jacob looked at him. He kept looking until Ken looked back. He took the man's hand again, squeezed hard. I'm sorry, he said. He meant it in its simplest form. I wish this were different. Ken nodded like a man nods at a thing he's already known but needed someone else to speak aloud. He dragged in a breath. Get her out, he said, jerking his head toward the woman. Her name is Nora. She's got a son. I'm right here, Nora said, voice suddenly too big. She had been sobbing quietly, trying not to. Now she swallowed the sound back down like a weapon she'd been forced to drop. I'm not leaving you. You are, Ken said. He closed his hand around Jacob's like he was passing something, and maybe he was. Tell him, he said to Nora. Tell Marcus he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The air was thick with unfinished sentences. The building groaned, longer this time, like a warning being repeated. The maintenance man turned his face away and then back again. He was crying without making any sound. Jacob loosened his grip and stood. He looked at Nora and didn't try to be gentle. We go now, he said. If you stay you die. I can't dig him out. I have to choose. The last word could have been a knife. He didn't flinch from saying it. Nora's face pulled into a shape Jacob had seen only at funerals, when a person realizes grieving must be done in front of other people. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them again, nodded once. She leaned in, kissed Ken on the dirt-streaked forehead. I love you, she said. It sounded like swallowing glass. Ken closed his eyes like a man climbed into a small boat and pushed off from a known shore. Jacob took Nora's elbow. He didn't rush her. He guided her because he had to place his hands on something right then. As they moved back through the corridor, past the frosted glass that no longer kept any secrets, the floor tilted and steadied. Jacob heard the distant whump of something else failing. The building's vocabulary was expanding. On the mezzanine again, he steered Nora toward the ladder. She moved like a dream caught in a body. When she hesitated at the lip, he didn't lie to her. One step, he said. Then another. He took the first in front of her this time, went down backward, eyes on her feet, hands open to catch and to reassure. She followed, her face wet and rigid. They made it. He put her hand into the waiting grip of someone solid and turned back without a word. Up again, the ladder protested. The wind through broken windows had changed direction. The sky looked strangely close, as if the smoke had dragged it down to meet them. He reached the top, swung onto the broken mezzanine, and in that motion through the new angle, saw across the space to where a bank of elevators yawned open like mouths. On the edge of one shaft, someone moved, half inside, clinging to the jamb. A woman in a once white blouse, now gray. She was pulling at something inside the car, which had stopped slightly below floor level, a lip of empty space like a trap. Help, she called, voice ragged. She's caught, her foot is. I can't. Jacob ran. He hated the way the floor sped under him here. He liked every inch of it under his feet, wanted to catalog it to check it was real. At the shaft he crouched and looked down. The elevator car had jammed with its roof just beyond reach. Between the floor and the car's roof was a gap. Inside, a young woman lay on her back, her foot trapped in the space between the car's wall and its mangled door. The other woman, her friend, stranger, was braced, holding her shoulders up, keeping her from sliding deeper. The young woman's eyes were huge and unfocused. She was saying please, please, as if the word itself could pry metal. All right, Jacob said to both of them. He glanced at the indicator panel. Dead. He wished he could kill the power again, twice, thrice. He swallowed. The building shuddered and the car moved a fraction, just enough to whisper. He met the eyes of the woman at the lip. We have to do this fast. How? She breathed. I've tried. Jacob lay on his stomach, the shaft's breath rose through his shirt. He reached down and found the trapped woman's ankle, felt the angle of her bones, the swell of flesh caught wrong. He slid his fingers as far as he could and felt metals bite. He didn't have a tool. He had no lever. He had his hands and her skin and the moving animal of the building under him. Can you push her foot toward me? He asked the woman braced inside. She shifted, teeth bared with effort, and the foot moved half a degree. Jacob slid his other hand in, pressed firmly, changed the angle, tried to free the tissue like easing a knot. He felt something give a little. The car creaked. A voice behind him said his name. He ignored it. He slid his hand deeper until metal kissed his knuckles, pressed harder. The trapped woman screamed that he didn't stop, that he had one kind of time. He twisted, the way you turn a key, and the foot slipped. For a second nothing happened, and then everything did. The foot slid free like a fish darting out of a net. Pull, he said, voice ground down. The woman inside hauled the freed woman by the shoulders. Jacob grabbed her wrist and hand and took some of the weight. They slid her across the roof and onto the broken lip. She sobbed and laughed at the same time, a sound that bent his head. He helped them both up, away from the shaft. He stood too fast, almost fainted, steadied himself with a hand on the jutting edge of a busted directory board. "Thank you," the woman said. "Thank you." Jacob nodded and tried to smile, found his mouth couldn't shape it. He turned back to the empty shaft and stared down into the dark. It looked like a throat to another world. His skin crawled. He backed away, then forced himself not to think of anyone else in any other car anywhere above or below. He couldn't carry that picture. He had a finite capacity and it was nearly full. His name again, this time clear. He turned. It was the teenage boy with the split lip, the one who had been with them on the service stairs. He looked older now. "You were looking for someone?" he said, awkward, as if the idea of interrupting carried a weight he could feel. "A woman? You kept turning your head like you were." "I think I saw her. On the 29th. With a cut here." He pointed to his temple. "She was with a group that went west." Jacob's breath left him in such a rush he had to brace his hand on his thigh to catch it. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He pictured the west stairwell buckling around the 15th. He saw dust. He saw the absence of anything you could put a hand on. He was not the kind of man who prayed, but he felt that same posture inside himself, that kneeling. He pushed against it. "Thanks," he said softly. The boy's mouth twisted. He looked like he regretted telling him. Jacob shook his head. He made himself reach out and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you." He didn't say, "I don't know what to do with that." He didn't say, "I might go into the place that is no longer a stairwell and not come back." He turned, got 2 steps, then 3, and then the building decided to insist again. It started as a hum low in his chest. Then another section of glass above trembled and bowed. A line appeared in a nearby support pillar like a thin smile, then widened into something ruthless. People screamed, the world went liquid and then very sharp. The mezzanine floor slanted 5 degrees in the space of a breath. Jacob dropped to a knee, hands flat, body remembering a childhood earthquake drill with a clarity that was brutal. Dust became a living thing, a lungful of it searing his throat. A light fixture snapped free and pendulumed in a lazy arc that could have been funny in another life. "Down!" someone shouted. Or maybe Jacob shouted it. Bodies hit the floor and stayed. The building groaned again and then, in a move that felt like resignation, settled back into something like balance. The slant held, though. It didn't give the angle back. The ladder to the outside trembled harder, a shiver running through its bones. Jacob saw a firefighter on it halfway up lock his elbows and freeze. He made himself stand. He made himself inventory. His brain did it like it had trained for it. People here, people there, exit viable but unstable, new cracks propagating, dust density increased, oxygen lower. He found the maintenance man by the edge of the mezzanine, hands on knees, breathing carefully, eyes scanning. They looked at each other and some agreement passed. There were no words left that did anything speaking hadn't already done. "Go," the maintenance man said. It was a direction outward, at the flow of people, not at Jacob in particular. He took it personally anyway. He found himself moving in small circuits, nudging, guiding, pushing 90-pound and 200-pound bodies toward a hole in the wall that led to a thing that led to the ground. Half the city's sirens were here now, layered like distant waves. He kept moving until his muscles trembled and his brain moved like an engine on fumes. He kept an image of Marissa in a clear square of his head like a picture on a desk. It was that precise, that still. It was not real and it was all he had. He thought of the stairwell west. He thought of the teenage boy's mouth when he had said he thought he had seen her. He thought of Ken under the desk, eyes closing because he had to. He thought of Nora's feet on the ladder rung, one after the other because that was the only direction left. When the ladder ceased again with a complaint like a wounded animal and a firefighter shouted for a halt, Jacob's body made a decision without consulting his mind. He turned not toward the exit, not toward the outside, but toward the interior, toward a corridor that led down to where West had been. The building's breath came cold from that direction, a draft from a wound. He walked into it. He moved alone for the first time in hours. It felt like stepping out of a current into a room where you could hear your own breath. The corridor sloped. The dust hung in eddies he made with his passage. The sounds of the mezzanine fell away behind him until they were just a part of the city's noise. He passed a wall mottled with handprints where people had steadied themselves, the prints different sizes layered on each other like an art, like a record. He put his own hand next to them just for half a second and then pulled it away. He reached the place where West's door hung ajar. The space beyond had been a stairwell once. Now it was a sculpture of failure. Concrete slabs had come down and come to rest mid-fall, stacked askew like the world's most dangerous books. Rebar laced like veins through broken planes. There were voids that could become tunnels if you turned your body in honest ways. It felt like approaching the inside of a hushed animal. It felt like going into a throat again, but one that was no longer part of a living thing. Jacob crouched. He called out Marissa. Once because he needed to put the name into the air. It didn't echo properly. The sound was swallowed by soft things. Dust, fabric, the endings of breaths. He listened and thought. For a second he heard a voice far down, not saying words but making the shape of them. It might have been the building. It might have been a human being. He went in. He went on hands and knees where he had to and belly where knees wouldn't do. He slid over concrete that ate his skin through his shirt. He breathed shallow because the dust had its own blade. He found a pocket where 2 slabs made a hut and crawled in. The air tasted like copper wiring and old smoke. He put his ear to the floor because stories had told him you can hear that way. He heard his own heart. He moved again, right shoulder scraping. He thought of what would happen if the slab above him decided it no longer trusted him. He kept moving. He found a shoe first, a flat with a bow, expensive, barely scuffed except at the toe where something had kissed it hard. He put his hand on it like he could transmit something through the leather. He let it go. He called again, a whisper now because the space made whispers seem appropriate. A sound came back that might be a voice, closer now. It was weaker than he wanted. "Hello," he said. "I'm here." Something shifted ahead, a small rock moving to make way for hope. He slid forward, pulled by that movement. He found a pocket where a body could be if that body had been lucky in about 7 very specific ways. He found a body. It wasn't Marissa. It was a young man in a button-down shirt that had been white once. His legs were twisted under a slab. He was awake, barely, eyes shining in the dim. He tried to smile with a mouth that didn't have the energy for it. "Hey," Jacob said. He wanted to feel disappointment or relief, some big attachment to seeing a stranger and not seeing the person his body had been moving toward. He felt neither. He felt the moment, only that. "Can you hear me?" The man nodded minutely, his lips moved. "Stuck," he whispered, a useless word with a true shape. "Yeah," Jacob said. He reached in and felt the slab. It was not going to move. He knew it deep in the part of his hands that had lifted too many things today. He put his palm on the man's chest, felt his breath, counted it to see if there was a pattern he would have to fear. It was thin but regular. "What's your name?" "Evan." "I'm Jacob." He didn't say it to be remembered. He said it because sharing names made rooms less empty. "I'm going to get help." He knew how ridiculous that sounded in this geometry. He said it anyway because it was the string he could hand Evan to hold. The man's eyes shifted, tried to look past Jacob, unfocused. There was a woman. Curly hair. He coughed, a dry scrape that shook his whole frame. She went down. She was screaming. He closed his eyes, opened them again. I think she was, okay, Jacob said because there was nothing else to say. He wanted to ask her name. He didn't. He reached into his pocket and found the small cylinder of water the firefighter had given him. He wet his finger and touched it to Evan's lips, then his tongue, careful not to flood his throat with dust. Evan breathed like he was starting to play an instrument again for the first time in a long time. "I'll be back," Jacob said. "Okay," Evan said. It sounded like he was agreeing to more than that. Jacob backed out the way he had come in. The edges of the slabs caught his shirt. He left a strip of it behind somewhere, cloth snagged like a flag. He bruised his hip and didn't register it. He found the outer corridor again in light that felt honest. He stood too fast, swayed, caught himself on torn drywall. He coughed until he saw stars. He went back toward the mezzanine, forced his legs to maintain a pace that didn't look like desperation because people read each other and he didn't want to add to their math. He found a firefighter by the ruined lobby directory, his face mask lifted, drinking water so fast it ran down his chin. He looked at Jacob and did that instant triage professionals do. "You hurt?" "No," Jacob said. "There's someone in West stairwell collapse. Evan. Alive. Pinch point. Needs extrication." He pointed, words landing like markers. He tried to be a map. 20 feet in. "You'll need shoring." The firefighter's shoulders went tighter under their gear, a current of attention. He lowered his bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his glove. "Show me," he said, adjusting his mask. He tapped the companion's shoulder and gestured. The companion, shorter, bulky with gear, grabbed a bag that had the weight and corners of something serious. Jacob led. The building moaned again. He didn't speed up. He heard in the firefighter's breath the sound of someone who had learned to conserve. They reached the mouth of the collapse. The firefighter clipped a line onto a piece of rebar like he was giving the building rules to follow. He put a hand on Jacob's shoulder and pressed him back with gentle authority. "We'll go," he said. "I can show you," Jacob said. "It's tight." "You've done enough," the firefighter said, and there was no praise in it, just acknowledgement. "Help get people out. Keep them moving. That's the game." The game. It was a word that didn't taint what it referred to. It was logistics. It was a way to think without drowning. Jacob nodded. He stepped back. He listened to the sound of the firefighters sliding into the throat. He wanted to stay, but he turned himself toward the ladder again. His legs remembered the way that he re-entered the light and sound like someone coming off a stage into a crowd. He put his hands up and began guiding again. Time flattened. When he later tried to reconstruct it, he would realize he had no idea if 15 minutes passed or 60. He saw faces and feet and the silver flash of a stretcher pushing up against refusal. He saw a man he had taken down earlier now sit on the curb beyond the ladder, held by paramedics, his head wrapped in white that looked obscene in all that dust. He saw Lily and her mother across the way, already in the hands of a woman in a reflective vest who was writing names on a clipboard. He saw Nora sitting on a piece of debris, hands clasped around nothing, eyes fixed at a point in the air like she could hold it still. He went up again. He came down with a woman in a green dress who kept saying she'd left her phone even though she held it. He watched his hands put other hands on rails, watched his mouth say words that made one foot go after the other. The building conversed around him in groans and snaps and silences that were like intakes of breath. At some point, on some return to the mezzanine, a sound changed in a way that had nothing to do with the local arrangement of steel and everything to do with the building's larger thesis collapsing. It was lower and longer, a drawn-out note that carried warning along its back. A firefighter at the ladder's base looked up at the building with a specificity that told Jacob he was reading more than he saw. "We're done," the firefighter said to someone on a radio. Pull back now." The ladder changed into a mouth that no longer admitted. People froze. A woman started to push and a firefighter put his hand flat against her sternum and said no in a voice that had the force of ranks behind it. "Back," he said, and the crowd shivered but moved. The air itself seemed to step away from the tower. Jacob stood on the lip and stared into the building that had become a landscape. He wanted to count again but knew the numbers would not soothe. He thought of Ken under the desk. He thought of Evan waiting under slabs. He thought of Marissa in the west stairwell somewhere above 15. He thought of the teenage boy saying he'd seen her. He thought of Lily's small half-smile and of Nora's feet one after the other. He thought of his own hands, how they had become something he trusted. Behind him, the street rolled with sirens and shouted names and the rubber squeal of wheels turning on gravel. In front of him, the building groaned like it was going to speak and finally name what it had been doing all this time. The floor under his feet tugged toward the gash of the exit as if the gravity inside wanted to reclaim him. He stepped back because that was what his body chose when asked. The tower shifted, a majestic slow-motion twist like an animal settling into sleep, then shook hard. A wave of brick dust rolled outward across the mezzanine like surf. Jacob put his arm over his mouth and turned away. He took 3 steps and felt the shock move through the soles of his feet, through his knees. He heard people scream the way a flock of birds takes off all at once. He kept walking until he was at the ladder's edge. He held the rail, leaned out and looked down at the alley. He saw the ground close and far at the same time. He took the first rung and then the second, one hand under, one over because that felt safest for no good reason. The ladder shook but held. He descended into shouting and open air and the immediate rush of hands, of voices trying to make sense of bodies. At the ground, someone grabbed his elbow. "Back," they shouted over the riot of noise. "Clear the area." He moved because he was told, because he could, because his body had weight and direction and the simplest obedience was a relief. He stepped into the street and turned back toward the place he had come from. The tower loomed, its lines no longer straight, its edges bent with stress. He stood in a field of white grit and watched as the building breathed one last time, a long tired inhale and then, somewhere deep inside, exhaled in a way that made the sky change. The collapse began not as a crash but as a series of decisions made by matter remembering gravity. The upper floors dipped out, a spine failed. Windows shattered outward like tears. The sound finally arrived, a rolling, thunderous body that washed over the block and kept going, and Jacob knew he would be carrying that sound in his bones until whatever after was came for him too. He realized his cheeks were wet and he couldn't tell if it was tears or dust or both. He pressed his palms together, not in prayer, not in anything except in an attempt to hold himself in place as everything else fell. He thought of all the faces he had seen and all the names he would never know. He thought of Marissa, the clear square in his head now blown open like a window in a storm. He thought of the choices, of the word choose spoken aloud in gray light. He held his breath as the building center collapsed into its bottom, a slow-motion implosion that gathered speed until the last of the tower gave up and poured into its own footprint, a plume of dust erupting upward like something alive. The wave of air hit him a second later, violent, carrying grit that stung his eyes and found its way deep into his throat. He coughed until his ribs hurt. People ran, tried to hold on to themselves, into each other. The ground trembled under his boots, then quieted. The plume rose and then spread, a great mushroom of powdered concrete and paper and everything else that had not been given a chance to burn. It began to snow flakes of office life, paper confetti, business cards, the corner of a photograph, the world's saddest ticker tape parade. Jacob stood still. When the dust thinned enough that shapes became more than silhouettes again, he recognized Nora sitting where he had last seen her, hands clasped harder now, eyes shut, mouth moving. He recognized the teenage boy with the split lip, his face turned upward as if trying to hear beyond hearing. He recognized Lily with a blanket draped around her shoulders and a juice box held like a talisman, her mother's hand threaded into her hair. He sat down on the curb because his legs decided. He put his face in his hands and then took it out of them because the world demanded eyes right now. A paramedic touched his shoulder and asked him something. He shook his head and then nodded, unsure what questions he was answering. He coughed again and felt something deep in his chest grind. When he could stand, he did that. He moved through the crowd like a ghost, this time with no intention but to witness. He walked to the knot of firefighters emerging from the dust at the far side of the block. One of them, the one who had gone into the west stairwell for Evan, caught his eye and shook his head once, smallest shift. Jacob absorbed it with a sensation like something clicking into place. He did not ask which part of the shake meant what. He knew the shape of it. He turned and scanned faces again, although there was no logic to it. He knew it and did it anyway. That he searched for Marissa in mouths and eyes and jawlines. He didn't find her. That he found a woman with curly hair and a cut at her temple, blood dried in a black line. He moved toward her so fast he almost tripped. He stopped within arm's reach and saw she wasn't Marissa, not even close. He nodded at her anyway and she nodded back, both of them recognizing a missing someone in the other's face. And then he did what his body had learned to do. He kept moving and made space where space needed making. He spoke names when people forgot their own. He told a man to breathe into his hands like it was a paper bag because panic had narrowed his eyes to black pinpoints. He pulled a tarp over a shape the paramedics couldn't help and did not look under it longer than it took to be sure there was no breath there to trap. He watched a fire crew organize the start of a pile of debris and wanted to put his muscles to their work until his brain reminded him there had been a reason they told him to back. When finally the first cold drops of rain began to fall from a sky that flipped its script in the wrong direction, the dust turned to paste on skin and in mouths. People tilted their faces to it as if it were absolution. Jacob stood in it and let it stripe clean paths down his cheeks. He thought of Ken and of the way Nora had kissed his forehead, of the tiny space where Evan had been alive 20 minutes ago, of the laugh that had not sounded like laughter when the young woman's foot came free. He thought of Marissa and felt the shape of her name in his mouth like a stone. He did not say it out loud. He swallowed it because some words belong inside for a while before they can be shared. He sat again when night began to think about coming. He sat near the paramedic originally told about the man on the 20th floor. The paramedic's shoulders had the set of someone moving to the next thing and then the next, a machine turned by grief. He sank down beside Jacob with a graceless thud and offered him a bottle of water and half a protein bar. Jacob took both and managed to chew without tasting anything. The paramedic stared into the middle distance. Name? He asked, not looking at Jacob, and Jacob understood he meant the person Jacob had been looking for. He gave it. He didn't say more. The paramedic wrote it on a piece of paper already crowded with ink. They sat like that long enough for the rain to stop being symbolic and start being water. In the distance, cranes moved like dinosaurs, and a line of red lights blinked to keep men in helmets from being swallowed by night. Jacob closed his eyes and opened them again. He had the sense that if he allowed sleep to trick him, he would be pulled backward into a day where decisions were still pending and nothing could protect him from living them again. When a woman in a municipal jacket came by later, asking anyone who had been in the building to tell her anything about the floors above, Jacob followed her to a folding table. He told her about the service stair and the shoring and the way the west stair felt wrong before it proved it. He told her about Lily and the burden of the lobby table, about a cracked pillar and a desk that almost moved enough. He told her about Evan and where to find him if there was still a where and if he was still a him. He did not tell her about Marissa. He didn't yet have words that would be useful to anyone but him for that. When he finished, he tried to stand and realized his legs had gone on strike. The municipal woman put her hand under his elbow and helped him up. She looked at him with the particular warmth of strangers whose only kindness is permission. Go home, she said. Or to a friend. He nodded like a man nods when he has no home in his throat and only the idea of one in his head. He walked toward the place where the police tape made bright lines in the gloom. He stopped, turned and looked at the pile of the building again. It had not become small with distance. It had become a horizon. He thought of all the rooms inside it that were still exactly themselves, perfectly ordinary, only pressed into a shape that meant they were no longer anything at all. He thought of the hands he had held and the ones he had let go. He thought of choose, the word a weight he knew he would carry for as long as his body remembered breath. He thought of the way the dust had turned to mud on his skin and made him into a version of himself he did not recognize. He exhaled. He did not go home. He drifted along the perimeter until he found a bench soaked with rain. He watched the night come all the way down. He watched the cranes work under lights that made their own stars. He watched the rescue crews move through the careful grammar of their labor. He kept his eyes open because for now, closing them would mean seeing, and seeing was something he could not yet survive. When dawn rinsed the sky pale and the city woke into a day that would forever hold the shape of the last one, he stood. He rolled his shoulders and felt their protest in bright threads. He turned toward the triage tent because helpful was a direction and he needed one. He started walking slow and let the day take him. He would keep saving who he could. He would keep grieving those he couldn't. He would keep the names he learned safe for as long as he had to. He would say Marissa out loud when he could. Not yet. Soon. Not because saying it would change anything but because sharing it would. And for the first time since the building had whispered through his shoes, he let the smallest piece of after shape itself around him, thin as paper, strong as a hand at your back when you're walking down a narrow ladder in the wind.